6,000 years ago, more than 1,000 years before the first stones of the Great Pyramid at Giza were quarried from the limestone plateau above the Nile, more than 2,000 years before the founding of Rome, more than 3,000 years before the birth of classical Athens, a civilization was building cities on the plains of what is now Ukraine, Romania, and Moldova that were larger than anything that would exist in Europe for the next 4 millennia. Cities of 10,000, 15,000, possibly even 20,000 people, spread across areas of more than 300 hectares, with hundreds of buildings arranged in concentric rings around central open spaces, connected by streets and pathways that followed a deliberate, planned design. Cities that were not cramped, walled fortresses huddled behind defensive ramparts, but sprawling, open settlements that covered more ground than most medieval European cities would occupy thousands of years later. Cities that were, by any reasonable measure, the largest human settlements on the face of the earth at the time they were built. And then they burned. Every one of them, deliberately, systematically, completely. The people who built these extraordinary settlements set fire to their own cities, reduced them to ash and rubble, and then moved to a new location and built again, only to burn the new settlement in its turn, in a cycle of construction and destruction that repeated itself across centuries, across hundreds of sites, across a region stretching from the Carpathian Mountains to the Dnieper River for more than 2,000 years. They built the largest settlements in the world. They burned them to the ground. They built again. They burned again. And when they finally stopped, sometime around the end of the 4th millennium before the Common Era, they left behind nothing but the charred remains of their cities, buried beneath the black earth of the Ukrainian and Romanian plains, invisible to the modern world until the development of aerial photography and satellite imaging revealed the ghostly outlines of their settlements, faint circles and rings etched into the soil by the ash of fires that burned 6,000 years ago. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, named twice, once by Romanian archaeologists, who called it Cucuteni, after the village in northeastern Romania, where the first major site was discovered in 1884, and once by Ukrainian archaeologists who called it Trypillia, after the village near Kiev, where the Ukrainian archaeologist Vikenty Kavoyka identified a related site in 1896. Two names for the same phenomenon, a culture that spanned modern national boundaries, and that produced, during its floret from approximately 4,800 to approximately 3,000 years before the Common Era, the largest settlements that had ever existed in human history up to that point, settlements that were not surpassed in size by any European city until the rise of classical Athens and Rome. More than 3,000 years later, by the end of tonight, you're going to understand what the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture was, how it was discovered, and why its existence has forced archaeologists to fundamentally reconsider their assumptions about the development of urban life in prehistoric Europe. You are going to learn about the extraordinary mega-settlements of the Ukrainian forest steppe, settlements that housed thousands of people in carefully planned communities at a time when the rest of Europe was living in scattered hamlets and isolated farmsteads. You are going to encounter the mystery of the deliberate burning, the ritual destruction of entire settlements that is one of the most enigmatic and most debated features of the Cucuteni-Trypillia archaeological record. And you are going to confront the question that haunts every study of a vanished culture, the question of why this civilization, which achieved a level of social organization and settlement size that was unmatched anywhere in the contemporary world, disappeared from history so completely that it was not rediscovered until the late 19th century and is still virtually unknown to the general public. The obscurity of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture is one of the great failures of historical education in the modern world. Virtually every educated person in Europe and North America has heard of Stonehenge, of the Egyptian pyramids, of the Mesopotamian ziggurats, of the Minoan palaces of Crete. How many have heard of Talyanki or Majdanetsk or Nebelivka? How many know that the largest settlements in the world, 6,000 years ago, were not in the Nile Valley or the Tigris-Euphrates floodplain, but on the black earth of the Ukrainian forest steppe. How many know that these settlements were larger in area than the cities that are conventionally credited as the birthplaces of urban civilization? The answer, for the vast majority of the world's population, is none. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture exists in a twilight zone of scholarly awareness, known to specialists in European prehistory, but invisible to the general public, a civilization that was among the most remarkable achievements of the prehistoric world, and that is among the least known achievements of any period. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The story of the Cucuteni-Trypillia is not merely an archaeological curiosity. It is a fundamental challenge to the way we understand the origins of European civilization. The standard narrative of European history traces the roots of civilization to the ancient Near East, to Mesopotamia and Egypt, and follows the transmission of urban life from the Near East to the Aegean, to Greece, and then to Rome, as though civilization moved in a single and unbroken line from east to west, gathering complexity as it went. The Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements demolish this narrative because they demonstrate that large-scale, organized, architecturally planned settlements existed in southeastern Europe at the same time as, or even earlier than, the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, and that these settlements developed independently without any demonstrable influence from the Near Eastern urban tradition. The scale of the challenge to conventional thinking cannot be overstated. For more than a century, the study of urbanization has been dominated by the Mesopotamian model, the assumption that cities originated in the fertile crescent of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, and that all subsequent urban development in Europe and elsewhere was derived from or influenced by this original model. The Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements are located more than 2,000 kilometers from Mesopotamia, in an entirely different ecological zone, with a fundamentally different economic base, and they predate the classical Mesopotamian cities by centuries. They developed not in an arid river valley requiring intensive irrigation, but on some of the most naturally fertile soils on Earth, soils that could be cultivated without irrigation, and that produced abundant harvests with relatively simple farming techniques. They were organized not around temples and palaces and administrative complexes, but around concentric rings of roughly equal-sized houses arranged around communal open spaces. They were, in every meaningful sense, a different kind of settlement from anything in the Near Eastern tradition, a form of communal living that the Near Eastern model had not predicted, and that the existing theories of urbanization could not easily explain. The largest Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements were contemporary with the earliest phases of Uruk, the Mesopotamian city that is traditionally regarded as the first true city in human history. Some scholars have argued that the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements were in fact larger than early Uruk, making them the largest human settlements in the world at the time of their existence. The implications of this claim, if it is sustained by the evidence, are staggering, because it means that the origins of urban life in Europe are not borrowed from the Near East, but indigenous, rooted in the specific environmental, economic, and cultural conditions of the European forest steppe, and that the history of European urbanization is thousands of years older and far more complex than the standard narrative allows. Now, let's begin. To understand the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, we must first understand the landscape in which it arose, because the story of this civilization is inseparable from the specific geography, climate, and ecology of the region that sustained it, a region of extraordinary agricultural potential that provided the economic foundation for one of the most remarkable experiments in communal living in human prehistory. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture occupied a broad swath of southeastern Europe, stretching from the eastern Carpathian Mountains in what is now Romania, across the rolling plains of Moldova, and into the forest steppe zone of central and western Ukraine. The territory covered by the culture at its maximum extent encompassed more than 350,000 square kilometers, an area roughly the size of modern Germany, making it one of the largest archaeological cultures of prehistoric Europe in terms of geographic extent. More than 3,000 Cucuteni-Trypillia sites have been identified across this territory, ranging from small hamlets of a few dozen houses to the extraordinary mega-settlements that are the most distinctive and most famous products of the culture. The sheer number of sites is itself a measure of the vitality and the success of the Cucuteni-Trypillia way of life, a cultural tradition that sustained itself across a vast territory and across more than 2,000 years of continuous development, adapting to local conditions while maintaining a recognizable cultural identity that is visible in the consistency of its pottery styles, its settlement patterns, and its ritual practices. The landscape of the Cucuteni-Trypillia heartland is dominated by a feature that is central to the story: the Chernozem, the Black Earth, one of the most fertile soil types on the planet. The Chernozem soils of Ukraine and Moldova are deep, rich in organic matter, and naturally well drained, the product of thousands of years of grassland vegetation growth and decomposition in a continental climate with cold winters and warm summers. These soils are among the most productive agricultural soils in the world, capable of supporting intensive cultivation of wheat, barley, and other cereal crops, without the need for the elaborate irrigation systems that were required in the arid environments of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The agricultural productivity of the Chernozem zone was the economic engine that powered the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, providing the food surpluses that supported large, concentrated populations and the social organization that governed them. The significance of the Chernozem for the Cucuteni-Trypillia story cannot be overstated. In Mesopotamia, the emergence of civilization was intimately linked to the development of irrigation, the construction of canals and waterworks that diverted the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to the surrounding fields, making agriculture possible in an arid environment where rainfall alone was insufficient. The irrigation systems required centralized coordination because the construction and maintenance of the canals was a collective enterprise that exceeded the capacity of individual households or small communities. The need for centralized coordination of irrigation is often cited as one of the primary drivers of state formation in Mesopotamia, creating the political institutions that eventually developed into the palace and temple complexes that governed the Mesopotamian cities. The Cucuteni-Trypillia people faced no such constraint. Their soils did not require irrigation. Their agriculture did not require centralized coordination of water management. They could grow their crops simply by plowing, sowing, and harvesting, using techniques that were within the capacity of individual households and small communities. The absence of irrigation may explain, at least in part, the absence of centralized political institutions in the Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements, because the economic driver that produced centralized authority in Mesopotamia was absent from the Cucuteni-Trypillia context. The forest steppe zone of Ukraine, where the largest Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements are found, occupies a transitional position between the dense forests of the north and the open grasslands of the steppe to the south. This transitional environment offered a mosaic of ecological niches that was particularly favorable for mixed farming economies. The forest margins provided timber for construction, fuel for heating and cooking, and mast, acorns, and other nuts for the feeding of domestic pigs. The open grasslands provided pasture for cattle and sheep. The river valleys that cut through the landscape provided water for irrigation and for domestic use, along with fish and waterfowl, and the rich Chernozem soils of the interfluves, the flat or gently rolling terrain between the river valleys, provided the agricultural land on which the Cucuteni-Trypillia economy depended. The ecological richness of the forest steppe was not merely a matter of soil quality, it was a matter of diversity, of the availability of multiple different resource types within a relatively compact area, each of which could be exploited in different seasons and for different purposes, creating an economy that was both productive and resilient. In the spring and summer, the Chernozem fields produced harvests of wheat, barley, and millet that fed the population and generated the surplus that supported craft specialists and communal construction projects. In the fall, the forests provided nuts, berries, and mushrooms that supplemented the diet and that could be stored for winter consumption. In the winter, domestic animals, cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats, provided meat, milk, hides, and wool, resources that could be produced even when the fields were dormant and the forests were bare. The year-round availability of diverse food resources was a critical factor in the ability of the Cucuteni-Trypillia communities to sustain large, concentrated populations because it reduced the vulnerability of the economy to the failure of any single resource and provided a buffer against the seasonal fluctuations that could destabilize communities dependent on a single crop or a single food source. The role of cattle in the Cucuteni-Trypillia economy deserves particular attention because cattle were not merely a food resource. They were a source of traction power, pulling the wooden ards, simple scratch ploughs that were used to cultivate the heavy Chernozem soils of the forest steppe. The adoption of animal traction was a transformative technological development that dramatically increased the amount of land that a single household could cultivate, expanding the agricultural base of the community and making it possible to support larger populations than would have been feasible with hand cultivation alone. Cattle were also a source of secondary products, milk, butter, cheese, and yogurt, that provided high-quality nutrition without the need to slaughter the animal, and a source of dung that could be used as fuel and as fertilizer for the fields. The centrality of cattle to the Cucuteni-Trypillia economy is reflected in the archaeological record, where cattle bones typically dominate the faunal assemblages from Cucuteni-Trypillia sites, outnumbering the bones of pigs, sheep, and goats by a significant margin. The agricultural foundation of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture was a mixed farming system that combined the cultivation of cereal crops, primarily wheat, barley, and millet, with the raising of domestic animals, primarily cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. The relative importance of crop cultivation and animal husbandry varied across the Cucuteni-Trypillia territory, with the western sites, in the more mountainous terrain of Romania and Moldova, showing a greater reliance on animal husbandry, and the eastern sites, in the flatter, more fertile terrain of the Ukrainian forest steppe, showing a greater reliance on crop cultivation. But across the culture as a whole, the economy was based on a diversified agricultural system that produced a reliable and abundant food supply, sufficient to support the large populations that inhabited the mega-settlements. The relationship between the agricultural economy and the cycle of settlement construction and destruction raises important questions about the management of agricultural land over time. If a mega-settlement was occupied for a period of several decades and then burned and abandoned, the agricultural land surrounding the settlement would have been cultivated intensively for the same period, potentially depleting the soil of nutrients and reducing its productivity. The relocation of the settlement to a new site, with access to fresh, uncultivated land, may have been motivated in part by the need to restore the productivity of the agricultural system, a strategy of shifting cultivations or long fallow agriculture that allowed exhausted fields to recover their fertility over a period of years, decades, while the community cultivated fresh land around the new settlement. This interpretation would explain both the practice of periodic abandonment and the consistent pattern of relocating to new sites rather than rebuilding on the same location, a pattern that makes ecological sense in the context of a pre-industrial agricultural system operating on soils that, however naturally fertile, could not sustain intensive cultivations indefinitely without fallow periods. The scale of the Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements is the feature that has attracted the most scholarly attention and the most public fascination, because the scale is genuinely extraordinary. The largest known Cucuteni-Trypillia settlement is Talianki, located in the Cherkasy region of central Ukraine, which covered an area of approximately 450 hectares and contained an estimated 1,500 to 2,700 buildings, housing a population that has been estimated at between 10,000 and 15,000 people. To put this in perspective, 450 hectares is roughly 4.5 square kilometers, an area larger than many modern small towns and larger than most ancient cities that are traditionally cited as milestones in the development of urbanization. The sheer number of buildings at Talianki is itself a staggering fact that deserves to be appreciated in concrete terms. if Talyanki contained 2,000 buildings, and each building required, at a minimum, the labour of 10 to 15 people working for several weeks to construct the wooden frame, weave the wattle walls, apply the daub, lay the clay floors, and thatch the roof. Then, the construction of the entire settlement represented hundreds of thousands of person-days of organised labour, an investment comparable to the construction of a modest Egyptian pyramid. The timber requirements alone would have been enormous. Each building required dozens of structural posts, hundreds of wattle rods, and rafters sufficient to span a floor area of 70 to 150 square metres. The total timber requirement for a settlement of 2,000 buildings would have amounted to tens of thousands of trees, felled with stone axes, transported to the construction site, and assembled into the frameworks of the buildings. The clay required for the daub walls and the floors would have amounted to thousands of cubic meters, dug from local sources, mixed with straw, and applied by hand to the wattle framework. The thatching material, straw or reeds, would have had to be harvested, bundled, and transported in quantities sufficient to cover 2,000 roofs. The logistics of construction, the sourcing and transportation of materials, the organization of labor, the coordination of building activity across a settlement covering more than 4 square kilometers imply a level of communal planning and collective effort that is extraordinary for any period of human history, let alone the 5th millennium before the Common Era. The site of Uruk in Mesopotamia, which is traditionally regarded as the first true city in human history, covered an area of approximately 250 hectares at its peak around 3200 before the Common Era, making it significantly smaller in area than Talyanki, which dates to approximately 3800 to 3700 before the Common Era, roughly 500 years earlier. The comparison between Talyanki and Uruk is one of the most provocative and most debated claims in the study of Cucuteni-Trypillia, because it challenges the conventional wisdom about the origins of urbanization. If Talyanki was indeed larger than early Uruk, and if it was indeed a functioning settlement, rather than a ceremonial centre or a seasonal gathering place, then the first large-scale human settlement in history was not in Mesopotamia, as the textbooks have long maintained, but in the Ukrainian forest steppe, a region that most people have never heard of, and that plays no role in the conventional narrative of civilizational origins. Other megasettlements in the Cucuteni-Trypillia region are similarly impressive. Maidanetska, also in the Cherkasy region, covered approximately 200 hectares and contained an estimated 1,500 to 1,600 buildings arranged in a distinctive pattern of concentric rings around a central open space. Nebelivka, in the Kirovorod region, covered approximately 238 hectares and has been the subject of extensive modern excavation by an international team led by the British archaeologist John Chapman and the Ukrainian archaeologist Mikhail Vidyako, whose work has provided some of the most detailed and most informative data available for any Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlement. Dobrovody, another mega-settlement in the Cherkasy region, covered approximately 250 hectares and contained more than 1,200 buildings. These are not isolated examples. More than a dozen settlements in the Cucuteni-Trypillia region have been identified with areas exceeding 100 hectares, and several dozen more have areas between 50 and 100 hectares, a density of large settlements that is unmatched anywhere in the world during the 5th and 4th millennia before the Common Era. The layout of the mega-settlements followed a distinctive pattern that was remarkably consistent across sites and across centuries, suggesting a shared architectural tradition and a shared conception of how a community should be organized in space. The typical mega-settlement consisted of buildings arranged in concentric oval or elliptical rings, with the outermost ring forming the boundary of the settlement and successive inner rings enclosing progressively smaller areas, culminating in a central open space that may have served as a communal gathering place, a market, or a ceremonial area. The buildings within each ring were placed close together, sometimes sharing walls, with their long axes oriented radially, like the spokes of a wheel, so that the entrances of the buildings faced inward, toward the center of the settlement. The spaces between the rings served as streets or pathways, providing circulation routes that connected the different parts of the settlement, and that allowed residents to move from the periphery to the center and back again. The consistency of this layout across dozens of sites suggests that the planning of a Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlement was not a casual or ad hoc process, but a deliberate, organized undertaking that followed a shared set of principles. And that required a significant level of communal coordination. Someone had to decide the size and shape of the settlement. Someone had to lay out the rings and determine the number and the placement of the buildings within each ring. Someone had to organize the construction of the buildings, ensuring that they were built in the correct locations and oriented in the correct directions. The planning and construction of a mega settlement was, in other words, a collective project that required leadership, coordination, and the subordination of individual preferences to a communal plan, qualities that are associated with social complexity and that imply a level of political or religious authority capable of directing the activities of a large population. The regularity of the concentric ring layout raises further questions about the social structure of the Cucuteni-Trypillia communities. In many ancient and modern settlements, the spatial arrangement of buildings reflects the social relationships among the people who inhabit them, with related families clustering together, with higher status households occupying more desirable locations, and with public or ceremonial buildings placed in prominent positions that reflect their importance to the community. The concentric ring layout of the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements may encode similar information about social organization, with each ring representing a distinct social group, perhaps a kinship group, an age cohort, or a territorial division, and with the position of each building within the ring reflecting the status or the function of the household that occupied it. The interpretation of the spatial pattern is slightly clear by the absence of clear evidence for social stratification, the absence of buildings that are dramatically larger or more elaborate than others. But the regularity of the pattern itself suggests that the arrangement was meaningful, that it reflected principles of social organization that were important to the community and that were embodied in the physical layout of the settlement. The sheer number of Cucuteni-Trypillia sites, more than 3,000 across the culture's territory, is itself a measure of the demographic vitality of the culture. If each site represents a single settlement occupation, and if each occupation lasted for a period of roughly 60 to 80 years, the estimated lifespan of a typical Cucuteni-Trypillia settlement before it was burned and relocated, then the 3,000 known sites represent a cumulative population that was enormous by the standards of prehistoric Europe. Even if we assume that many of the known sites were occupied simultaneously, the total population of the Cucuteni-Trypillia territory at any given time may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands, a population that would have made the Cucuteni-Trypillia region one of the most densely settled parts of Europe during the 5th and 4th millennia before the Common Era. The buildings of the Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements were themselves substantial structures, typically rectangular in plan, with floors of fired clay or compacted earth, walls of wattle and daub, a framework of wooden posts interwoven with branches and coated with a thick layer of clay, and roofs of thatch. The fired clay floors are one of the most archaeologically distinctive features of Cucuteni-Trypillia buildings, because the firing process, whether deliberate or the result of the periodic burning of the settlements, transformed the clay into a hard, durable material that has survived in the archaeological record for 6,000 years, preserving the outlines of the buildings and, in some cases, the impressions of the objects that rested on them at the time of the burning. The preservation of these clay platforms is, paradoxically, the most important archaeological consequence of the practice of deliberate burning, because the burning transformed perishable wooden buildings into durable ceramic records, creating an archaeological signature that is far more visible and far more informative than the remains of unburned buildings would have been. Without the burning, the the Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements might have left almost no trace in the archaeological record, and the culture might never have been discovered. The very practice that destroyed the settlements also preserved them, converting wood and clay into fired ceramic that has endured for 60 centuries. The average size of a Cucuteni-Trypillia building was approximately 70 to 150 square meters, comparable in size to a modern 2 or 3 bedroom house, and many buildings contained internal divisions that suggest the separation of living, working, and storage areas within a single structure. The material culture of the Cucuteni-Trypillia people was rich, varied, and artistically sophisticated. The most famous products of the culture are its ceramics, which are among the finest and most elaborately decorated pottery vessels produced anywhere in the prehistoric world. Cucuteni-Trypillia pottery is characterized by its thin walls, its elegant forms, and its elaborate painted decoration, which typically features complex geometric patterns, spirals, waves, and bands of contrasting colors, usually red, black, and white, applied before firing with a skill and a consistency that suggest the work of specialized potters. The pottery has been classified into numerous typological categories based on form, decoration, and chronological period, and it provides the primary basis for the archaeological chronology of the culture, the sequence of phases and subphases that allows archaeologists to date individual sites and to track the development of the culture over time. The sophistication of Cucuteni-Trypillia pottery deserve emphasis because it challenges the assumption, common in popular discourse, that prehistoric European cultures were technologically and artistically primitive. The finest Cucuteni-Trypillia vessels are masterworks of ceramic art, with walls as thin as 3 to 4 millimeters, surfaces burnished to a high gloss, and painted decorations of extraordinary precision and complexity. The spiral motifs that are characteristic of the culture are not simple, repetitive patterns. They are intricate, interlocking compositions that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of geometry, symmetry, and visual rhythm. The colors are vivid and durable, the product of carefully controlled firing techniques that required specialized knowledge of clays, pigments, and kiln temperatures. The production of pottery of this quality implies the existence of craft specialists, individuals, or workshops that devoted significant time and skill to the production of ceramics, and that the community supported these specialists by providing them with food, materials, and the time needed to perfect their craft. Beyond pottery, the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture produced a remarkable array of clay figurines, primarily anthropomorphic figures representing the human body, in various poses and with various degrees of stylization. The majority of the figurines depict female bodies, with rounded hips, prominent breasts, and simplified facial features, though male figurines and animal figurines are also found. The figurines range in size from miniature examples a few centimeters tall to larger pieces approaching 30 centimeters, and they vary widely in their degree of naturalism, from highly stylized, almost abstract forms to more realistic representations that capture details of hairstyle, clothing, and bodily posture. The function of the figurines remains the subject of scholarly debate, but their abundance at Cucuteni-Trypillia sites, with some sites yielding hundreds or even thousands of examples, indicates that they played an important role in the cultural and possibly the religious life of the community. The technology of building construction in the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture was more sophisticated than the simple description of wattle and daub might suggest. The buildings were substantial structures that required considerable skill and effort to construct. The framework consisted of wooden posts set into the ground at regular intervals, forming the skeleton of the building. Between the posts, a lattice of smaller branches was woven to create the wattle, and this lattice was then coated on both sides with a thick layer of clay mixed with straw or other plant fibers to create the daub. The floors were constructed of a layer of clay, often several centimeters thick, that was carefully smoothed and, in many cases, deliberately fired, either by building a fire on the floor surface or by the burning of the building at the end of its occupation. The roofs were constructed of thatch, bundles of straw or reeds laid over a framework of wooden rafters. The completed building was a solid, weatherproof structure that provided comfortable shelter from the cold winters and warm summers of the Ukrainian forest steppe. The interior of a typical Cucuteni-Trypillia building was divided into 2 or more rooms by internal partitions of wattle and daub. The main room typically contained a large clay oven, a raised platform or bench that may have served as a sleeping area, and storage vessels for grain, water, and other household necessities. A secondary room or rooms served as storage areas, workspaces, or additional living quarters. Some buildings contained elaborate clay altars or platforms that may have served a ritual function, decorated with painted designs and associated with concentrations of figurines and other objects that suggest ceremonial use. The presence of these ritual features within domestic buildings suggests that religious practice in the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture was not confined to specialized temples or shrines, but was integrated into the daily life of the household, a domestic religion in which the home served simultaneously as a dwelling, a workshop, and a sacred space. The population estimates for the largest Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements have been the subject of considerable debate, because the estimates depend on assumptions about the density of occupation, the number of people per building, and the proportion of buildings that were occupied at any given time. The most commonly cited estimates for Talyanki, the largest known mega-settlement, range from 10,000 to 15,000 people, based on the assumption that the settlement contained approximately 1,500 to 2,700 buildings, and that each building housed a family of roughly 5 to 7 people. Some scholars have proposed higher estimates, arguing that the density of occupation was greater than the standard assumptions suggest, while others have proposed lower estimates, arguing that not all of the buildings were occupied simultaneously, and that some may have served non-residential functions as storehouses, workshops, or ceremonial spaces. The debate is unlikely to be resolved without further excavation, but even the most conservative estimates place the population of Talyanki in the range of several thousand people, a population that is extraordinary for any settlement of the 5th or 4th millennium before the Common Era, and that places Talyanki among the largest human communities in the world at the time of its existence. The site of Majdanetsky has been the subject of particularly detailed investigation, including an extensive geophysical survey conducted by a German-Ukrainian collaborative team in the 2000s that mapped the entire layout of the settlement with remarkable precision. The survey revealed a settlement of approximately 200 hectares containing roughly 1,575 buildings, arranged in the characteristic concentric ring pattern of the Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements. The buildings were organized into 9 or 10 concentric rings, with the outermost ring measuring approximately 1.5 kilometers in diameter. The survey also revealed the presence of internal corridors or streets between the rings, confirming the planned character of the settlement and providing detailed data on the spatial organization of the community. The population of Majdanetsky, based on the number of buildings and standard assumptions about household size, has been estimated at approximately 7,000 to 12,000 people, making it one of the largest settlements in the world during the period of its occupation, roughly 3,900 to 3,800 before the Common Era. The geophysical survey at Majdanetsky also revealed a number of features that have enriched our understanding of the internal organization of the mega-settlements. Within the concentric rings, the survey identified what appear to be assembly houses or communal buildings, structures that are significantly larger than the standard residential buildings, and that are located at regular intervals around the settlement, as though each section of the settlement had its own communal meeting place. These larger structures may have served as venues for neighborhood-level decision-making, for communal storage, or for ritual activities that involved the residents of a particular section of the settlement. The regular spacing and consistent size of these larger buildings suggest that the settlement was organized into discrete neighborhoods or quarters, each with its own internal organization and its own communal facilities, a pattern that is consistent with the hypothesis that the mega-settlements were governed by a decentralized system of neighborhood-level, governance, rather than by a single centralized authority. The site of Nebelivka, investigated by the British archaeologist John Chapman and his Ukrainian colleagues, has provided equally important data. Chapman's project, which combined geophysical survey, targeted excavation, and a wide range of analytical techniques, was one of the first large-scale international excavations of a Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlement, and its results have been published in a series of detailed reports that have become essential references for the study of the culture. The geophysical survey at Nebelivka revealed a settlement of approximately 238 hectares containing more than 1,400 buildings arranged in the characteristic concentric ring pattern. The excavations, which sampled a cross-section of the settlement's buildings, revealed a range of building types, from small, apparently residential structures to larger buildings with evidence of specialized functions, including craft production, storage, and ritual activity. The excavations also revealed the remains of the deliberate burning that ended the settlement's occupation, with layers of fired clay, charcoal, and ash covering the floors of the excavated buildings, and providing dramatic evidence of the intensity and the thoroughness of the conflagration. The site of Dobrovolye, another major mega-settlement in the Cherkasy region, has been less extensively investigated than Maidanetske or Nebelivka, but aerial photography and preliminary geophysical survey have revealed a settlement of approximately 250 hectares, containing more than 1,200 buildings, making it one of the largest settlements in the Cucuteni-Trypillia corpus. The site of Tomashovka, also in the Cherkasy region, covered approximately 240 hectares and contained an estimated 1,100 buildings. The cumulative evidence from these and other mega-settlements paints a picture of a cultural tradition that was capable of producing settlements of extraordinary size and remarkable consistency, settlements that followed a shared architectural plan, that were organized according to shared principles of spatial design, and that were maintained and periodically renewed through the practice of deliberate burning and relocation. Then something happened that changed everything. The core problem of Cucuteni-Trypillia studies is not the scale of the settlements, though the scale is extraordinary and demands explanation. It is not the sophistication of the material culture, though the pottery and the figurines are among the finest products of prehistoric European craftsmanship. The core problem is the burning, the deliberate, systematic, apparently ritualized destruction of entire settlements by fire, repeated across hundreds of sites and across more than 1,000 years of cultural continuity, a practice so unusual, so counterintuitive, and so difficult to explain that has dominated scholarly debate about the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture for more than a century. The evidence for the deliberate burning of Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements is extensive, well-documented, and largely unambiguous. At site after site, the archaeological record shows a consistent pattern. Buildings were constructed with care, occupied for a period of decades, and then destroyed by fire so intense that the clay walls and floors were fired to a hardness comparable to kiln-fired pottery. The burning was not partial or selective. It affected entire settlements, consuming all or nearly all of the buildings in a single conflagration. The burning was not accompanied by evidence of warfare or hostile destruction. There are no defensive fortifications at most Cucuteni-Trypillia sites. There are no weapons caches, no concentrations of projectile points embedded in walls or defenses, no mass graves of individuals killed by violence. The burning appears to have been deliberate, planned, and executed by the inhabitants of the settlements themselves, a controlled destruction that was part of the cultural cycle of the community rather than a catastrophe imposed from outside. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how unusual this practice is. In the entirety of the human archaeological record, spanning hundreds of thousands of years and encompassing millions of sites on every inhabited continent, the deliberate, systematic burning of entire settlements as a regular cultural practice is virtually unique to the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture. Settlements have been destroyed by fire in many cultures and many periods, but the destruction is almost always the result of warfare, accident, or natural disaster, not of deliberate, planned, communal action. The Cucuteni-Trypillia practice of deliberate burning stands alone, a cultural phenomenon without clear parallel, and its uniqueness is itself a measure of its strangeness and of the difficulty of explaining it within the existing frameworks of archaeological interpretation. The intensity of the burning is itself significant. Experiments conducted by archaeologists have demonstrated that the temperatures required to fire the clay walls and floors of Cucuteni-Trypillia buildings to the degree observed in the archaeological record would have required sustained combustion at temperatures of 800 to 1000 degrees Celsius, temperatures that are difficult to achieve by the accidental ignition of a wooden building, but that can be achieved by the deliberate addition of large quantities of fuel. The evidence suggests that the inhabitants of the settlements prepared their buildings for burning, possibly by filling them with fuel, straw, wood, grain, or other combustible materials, before igniting them, ensuring that the fire burned hot enough and long enough to consume the entire structure and to fire the clay walls and floors to a ceramic-like hardness. Experimental archaeology has provided dramatic confirmation of these conclusions in a series of experiments conducted in the early 2000s. Archaeologists constructed replica Cucuteni-Trypillia buildings using traditional materials and techniques, and then set them afire under controlled conditions. The experiments demonstrated that a building filled with additional fuel could reach and sustain the temperatures required to fire the clay to the degree observed in the archaeological record, while a building without additional fuel burned at much lower temperatures and produced clay fragments that were noticeably softer and less thoroughly fired. The experiments also revealed the enormous volume of fuel required to achieve the temperatures documented in the archaeological record, suggesting that the preparation for burning involved the collection and stockpiling of large quantities of combustible material, a process that would have required planning, organization, and the collective effort of the community. The burning was not a spontaneous act. It was a planned event, prepared over a period of days or weeks, and executed with a thoroughness that left nothing to chance. The preparation required for this kind of controlled destruction is itself evidence of intentionality, because accidental fires caused by lightning, by cooking accidents, or by the carelessness of individuals, do not typically burn hot enough or uniformly enough to produce the effects observed in the Cucuteni-Trypillia record. Several theories have been proposed to explain the deliberate burning. The earliest and most widely known theory, proposed by Romanian archaeologists in the early 20th century, interpreted the burning as evidence of enemy attack, arguing that the settlements were destroyed by hostile raiders, possibly from the steppe to the east, who overran the communities and set them afire. This theory was consistent with the historical experience of the region, which has been subject to repeated waves of invasion from the Eurasian steppe throughout recorded history, and it appealed to the assumption, common in early 20th century archaeology, that the destruction of settlements was typically the result of warfare. But the theory has been largely abandoned by modern scholars because the archaeological evidence does not support it. There are no defensive fortifications. There are no weapons concentrations. There are no mass graves. There is no evidence of the kind of hasty, chaotic destruction that characterizes settlements destroyed by enemy attack. The burning appears to have been orderly, systematic, and planned, characteristics that are inconsistent with the warfare hypothesis, and that point instead to a deliberate, internally motivated practice. A second theory, which has gained widespread acceptance among modern scholars, interprets the burning as a ritual act, a deliberate destruction of the settlement that served a symbolic or religious function within the cultural system of the community. According to this theory, the burning was the final act in the life cycle of a settlement, a ceremonial conclusion that marked the end of one phase of communal life and the beginning of another. The settlement was built, occupied, and then destroyed, and the destruction was not a catastrophe but a culmination, the completion of a cycle that the community understood as natural, necessary, and meaningful. The theory draws support from ethnographic parallels. the practices of various cultures around the world that deliberately destroy or abandon their settlements at regular intervals, and, from the internal evidence of the Cucuteni-Trypillia, sites themselves which show a pattern of construction, occupation, and destruction that is too regular and too consistent to be explained by accident or by external attack. A third theory proposes that the burning served a practical purpose, sanitizing the settlement and eliminating the accumulated waste, vermin, and disease organisms that would inevitably build up in a large, densely occupied community over a period of decades. Living in close quarters with domestic animals, storing grain in buildings that attracted rodents and insects, and generating organic waste that decomposed on the settlement surface, would have created conditions favourable for the spread of disease. Burning the settlement, according to this theory, would have eliminated these health hazards, sterilising the site and creating conditions that were favourable for rebuilding. The theory is plausible but incomplete, because it does not explain why the settlements were rebuilt on new locations rather than on the cleared sites of the burned settlements, a pattern that suggests that the burning was not merely a practical measure, but had a cultural or symbolic dimension that went beyond hygiene. A fourth theory, advanced by some scholars in recent years, proposes that the burning was connected to the death of a significant individual or to a transition in the leadership of the community. In many cultures around the world, the death of a chief, a priest, or other important figure is marked by the destruction or abandonment of the dwelling or the community associated with that individual. If the Cucuteni-Trypillia communities were organized around a system of leadership in which the leader's identity was closely associated with the settlement itself, then the death or the departure of the leader might have triggered the abandonment and destruction of the settlement, and the founding of a new settlement under new leadership. This theory is speculative and difficult to test against the archaeological evidence, but it is consistent with the general pattern of periodic destruction and rebuilding that characterizes the Cucuteni-Trypillia record. But here is the problem. The ritual burning hypothesis, while widely accepted, is not without its difficulties. The burning of a Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlement was not a minor event. It was the destruction of a community that had been built, occupied, and maintained over a period of decades, a community that represented an enormous investment of labour, materials, and social organisation. The buildings had to be constructed, the fields had to be cleared and cultivated, the social relationships that bound the community together had to be established and maintained. The destruction of all of this, the deliberate reduction of decades of collective effort to ash and rubble, is an act of extraordinary cultural confidence, a demonstration that the community valued the process of building and rebuilding more than it valued the permanence of any particular settlement. The practice makes sense only if the community had a cultural framework that gave meaning to the destruction, that interpreted the burning not as a loss but as a transformation, not as an ending but as a renewal, a framework that we can infer from the evidence, but that we cannot reconstruct in detail because the Cucuteni-Trypillia people left no written record of their beliefs. The cultural confidence required for the practice of deliberate burning is itself worthy of reflection. To burn a settlement is to destroy the accumulated material product of decades of communal labour, the buildings, the stored grain, the household goods, the craft tools, the personal possessions, everything that the community has produced and accumulated over the lifetime of the settlement. The decision to burn implies a community that was confident in its ability to rebuild, confident that the resources, the labour, the organisational capacity, and the cultural knowledge needed to construct a new settlement would be available when the old one was destroyed. It implies a community that valued the intangible bonds of social solidarity, the shared beliefs and practices that held the group together, more than the tangible products of material accumulation, a community that understood at a fundamental level that the true wealth of the community lay not in its buildings or its possessions, but in the relationships, the knowledge, and the traditions of its members. The burning was an act of faith, faith in the community's capacity to renew itself, faith in the cycle of creation and destruction that the community understood as the natural rhythm of communal life, faith that the world that rose from the ashes would be as good as or better than the world that had been consumed by the flames. The archaeological evidence for what happened after the burning provides additional insight into the cycle of destruction and renewal. At many Cucuteni-Trypillia sites, the burned settlement was not immediately rebuilt on the same location. Instead, the community relocated to a new site, typically within a few kilometers of the old one, and built a new settlement from scratch, following the same concentric ring plan and the same architectural conventions as the previous settlement. The old site was abandoned, its burned remains left undisturbed, gradually covered by soil and vegetation, until the ghostly outlines of its concentric rings were visible only from the air, etched into the landscape by the differential growth of crops and grasses over the fired clay and ash that lay beneath the surface. The pattern of relocation, rather than rebuilding on the same site, is itself significant, because it suggests that the burning was not merely a cleansing of the settlement, but a closing, a final act that marked the end of the settlement's life, and that required the community to begin again in a new place, with fresh resources and fresh possibilities. And it gets worse. The question of whether the mega-settlements were permanently occupied or only seasonally or periodically occupied is one of the most contentious issues in Cucuteni-Trypillia studies, because the answer has profound implications for how we interpret the settlements and for how we assess their place in the history of urbanization. If the mega-settlements were permanently occupied, with populations of 10,000 to 15,000 people living year-round in the settlement, then they were true cities, urban centers comparable in scale to the earliest cities of Mesopotamia and entitled to the same recognition in the history of civilization. If they were only seasonally or periodically occupied, serving as gathering places for dispersed populations that came together at certain times of the year for ceremonies, markets, or collective labor, then they were something different. Not cities in the conventional sense, but something without a clear parallel in the archaeological record, a form of settlement that does not fit neatly into the existing categories of archaeological classification. The evidence on this question is ambiguous, and the ambiguity has fueled a scholarly debate that remains unresolved. The enormous size of the mega-settlements and the dense arrangement of buildings within them suggest permanent occupation, because the construction of so many buildings, often exceeding 1,000 in a single settlement, seems difficult to justify if the settlement was only used for part of the year. The agricultural economy of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, based on the cultivation of cereal crops that require year-round attention, ploughing in the spring, tending in the summer, harvesting in the fall, and storage in the winter, also suggests permanent occupation, because the dispersal of the agricultural population away from the settlement for extended periods would have been impractical. But the faunal and botanical remains from some mega-settlements suggest a more complex picture, with evidence of seasonal variation in the intensity of occupation, and with some areas of the settlement showing less intensive use than others. Patterns that are consistent with periodic rather than permanent occupation. Some scholars have proposed a compromise interpretation, arguing that the mega-settlements were permanently occupied by a core population of perhaps a few thousand people, with additional population influxes at certain times of the year for seasonal ceremonies, collective construction projects, or communal agricultural activities. This model would explain both the large number of buildings, many of which may have been used only part of the year, and the evidence of year-round agricultural activity, which would have been the responsibility of the permanent core population. The compromise model is consistent with ethnographic parallels from other parts of the world, where seasonal gathering places attract populations from surrounding areas at specific times of the year, while maintaining a smaller permanent population during the rest of the year. The excavations at Nebelivka, conducted by John Chapman and his colleagues between 2009 and 2014, have provided some of the most detailed evidence bearing on this question. Chapman's team used a combination of geophysical survey, targeted excavation, and systematic sampling to investigate the structure, the occupation history, and the function of the settlement. Their findings suggest that Nebelivka was not a densely packed urban centre, but a dispersed community, with clusters of buildings separated by open spaces that may have been used for agriculture, animal husbandry, or communal activities. The population of Nebelivka, based on the density and the distribution of residential buildings, may have been smaller than earlier estimates suggested, perhaps in the range of 3,000 to 6,000 people, rather than the 10,000 to 15,000 that have been proposed for larger mega-settlements like Talyanki. Chapman's research also produced important evidence about the nature of the buildings themselves. Excavation of individual buildings at Nebelivka revealed that many of the structures showed evidence of relatively brief occupation, with thin occupation deposits and limited evidence of long-term domestic activity. Some buildings appeared to have been occupied for only a few years, before being destroyed in the general conflagration that ended the settlement. Others showed evidence of more extended occupation, with thicker deposits, more diverse artifact assemblages, and more extensive evidence of domestic activity. The variation in occupation intensity across the settlement supports the hypothesis that Nebelivka was not a uniformly dense, permanently occupied urban centre, but a more community in which different areas were used in different ways and at different intensities, a pattern that is consistent with the compromise interpretation of seasonal or periodic occupation with a permanent core population. The work at Nebelivka also shed new light on the organization of economic activity within the megasettlements. Analysis of the distribution of craft production debris, including pottery manufacturing waste, stone tool production debris, and weaving equipment, revealed that craft production was dispersed throughout the settlement rather than concentrated in specialized workshops, a pattern that is consistent with household-level production rather than centralized craft specialization. The implication is that the economy of the mega-settlements was organized at the household level, with each household producing most of the goods it needed for its own consumption, rather than being organized around centralized production facilities staffed by full-time specialists. This household-based economic organization is consistent with the egalitarian interpretation of the mega-settlements because it suggests that economic resources and productive capacity were distributed relatively evenly across the community, rather than being concentrated in the hands of a privileged few. These findings do not resolve the question of permanent versus seasonal occupation, but they suggest that the mega-settlements were more complex and more varied in their organization than the simple model of a permanently occupied urban center would imply. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements, whatever their exact nature and whatever the exact size of their populations, represent a form of social organization that has no clear parallel anywhere else in the prehistoric world. They are too large to be villages. They are too dispersed to be cities in the conventional Near Eastern sense. They lack the defensive walls, the monumental temples, the palaces, and the centralized administrative infrastructure that characterize the earliest cities of Mesopotamia. They have no writing, no seals, no standardized weights and measures, no evidence of the bureaucratic apparatus that managed the economies of the Near Eastern cities. And yet they organized thousands of people into planned communities of extraordinary size, communities that were maintained for decades and then deliberately destroyed and rebuilt in a cycle that suggests a level of communal organization and cultural coherence that is without precedent in the European archaeological record. The discovery of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture by modern scholarship is a story that unfolds across more than a century of archaeological investigation, shaped by the political boundaries, the institutional rivalries, and the ideological conflicts that have marked the history of southeastern Europe from the late 19th century to the present day. The first major discovery came in 1884 when the Romanian scholar Teodor Barada identified an archaeological site near the village of Cucuteni in the Iași county of northeastern Romania. Subsequent excavations at the site, conducted by Romanian archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, revealed a sequence of occupation layers containing elaborate painted pottery, clay figurines, and the remains of buildings with fired clay floors, all of which were recognized as the products of a previously unknown prehistoric culture. The Romanian archaeologists named the culture Cucuteni after the type site and began the process of classifying its pottery, establishing its chronology, and mapping the distribution of its sites across northeastern Romania and adjacent Moldova. Independently, in 1896, the Ukrainian archaeologist Vicenti Kvoika identified a related site near the village of Trypillia, south of Kiev, during construction work that exposed archaeological deposits containing painted pottery, figurines, and the remains of burned buildings. Kvoika, a Czech-born archaeologist who had settled in Kiev and who would become one of the most important figures in Ukrainian archaeology, recognized the similarities between the Trypillia material and the Cucuteni material that had been described by the Romanian archaeologists, and he proposed that both belonged to a single, widespread prehistoric culture. Kvoika's identification of the Trypillia culture was a landmark moment in the study of European prehistory because it demonstrated for the first time that a single archaeological culture could span the territory of multiple modern nation-states, and that the political boundaries of the present bear no relationship to the cultural boundaries of the distant past. Kvoika went on to excavate several additional Trypillia sites in the vicinity of Kiev, establishing the basic chronological and typological framework that would guide Ukrainian research on the culture for decades to come. The Ukrainian archaeologists named their version of the culture Trypillia after Kvoika's type site and began their own program of survey, excavation, and classification. The dual naming of the culture, Cucuteni in Romania and Trypillia in Ukraine, reflects the political division of the culture's territory between two modern nation-states, a division that has had significant consequences for the study and the interpretation of the culture. Romanian and Ukrainian archaeologists have traditionally worked independently of each other, publishing their findings in different languages, using different terminological systems, and operating within different institutional and ideological frameworks. The result has been a fragmentation of knowledge about the culture, with Romanian scholars knowing the Western sites in detail, and Ukrainian scholars knowing the Eastern sites in detail, but with little systematic integration of the two bodies of data. The political dimension of the naming controversy should not be underestimated. In both Romania and Ukraine, the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture has been adopted as a symbol of national identity and historical pride, a prehistoric civilization that demonstrates the deep roots and the cultural richness of the national territory. Romanian scholars have emphasized the Western Cucuteni dimension of the culture, highlighting the sites in northeastern Romania and presenting the culture as a precursor to later Romanian civilization. Ukrainian scholars have emphasized the eastern Trypillia dimension, highlighting the mega-settlements of the Ukrainian forest steppe and presenting the culture as evidence of the deep historical significance of Ukrainian territory. The competition between these national narratives has sometimes produced more heat than light, with scholars on both sides investing the culture with meanings and significances that reflect modern national aspirations rather than the evidence of the archaeological record. The international archaeological community has attempted to navigate this political minefield by using both names, hyphenated, but the compromise is itself a reminder of the political forces that have shaped the study of the culture from its earliest days. This fragmentation has been gradually overcome in recent decades, as international collaborative projects have brought Romanian, Ukrainian, Moldovan, and Western European archaeologists together to work on the culture as a single phenomenon. But the legacy of the division remains visible in the scholarship, and the culture continues to be known by two names, a reminder of the political complexities that have shaped the study of the European past. The discovery of the mega-settlements, the truly enormous settlements that are the most distinctive and most spectacular feature of the culture, came relatively late in the history of Cucuteni-Trypillia studies. The mega-settlements are concentrated in the eastern part of the culture's territory, in central and western Ukraine, and their full extent was not appreciated until the development of aerial photography and, more recently, geophysical survey and satellite imagery made it possible to map the outlines of settlements that covered hundreds of hectares and that were far too large to be comprehended from ground level. The first major investigations of the mega-settlements were conducted by Soviet archaeologists in the 1970s and 80s, using a combination of aerial photography, surface survey, and targeted excavation to document the size, the layout, and the content of settlements like Talianki, Maidanetska, and Dobrovody. These investigations revealed for the first time the true scale of the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements, and their findings, published in Russian and Ukrainian, gradually attracted the attention of the international archaeological community. The work of Soviet archaeologists like Nikolai Shmagly, who conducted pioneering surveys of the mega-settlements in the Cherkasy region during the 1970s, and of Ukrainian archaeologists like Mikhail Vidiko, who has been instrumental in bringing the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements to international attention since the 1990s, deserves particular recognition. Shmagly's aerial photographic surveys were among the first to reveal the full extent of the mega-settlements, documenting the concentric ring patterns and the enormous spatial extent of sites like Talianki and Maidanetsky. Vidiko's subsequent work, combining traditional archaeological methods with modern geophysical techniques, has provided much of the detailed data on which current interpretations of the mega-settlements are based. The collaboration between Vidiko and the British archaeologist John Chapman at Nebelivka and other sites has been one of the most productive partnerships in the history of Cucuteni-Trypillia studies, bringing together the deep local knowledge of the Ukrainian archaeological tradition and the methodological innovations of Western European archaeology in a way that has advanced the understanding of the culture far beyond what either tradition could have achieved alone. The math is striking when we consider the logistical requirements of building and maintaining a mega-settlement on the scale of Talianki or Maidanetsky, a settlement of 1,500 buildings, each measuring roughly 70 to 150 square meters, with walls of wattle and daub and floors of fired or compacted clay, would have required the felling and transport of tens of thousands of trees, the mixing and application of thousands of cubic meters of clay, the harvesting and transport of tons of thatching material, and the organized labor of hundreds of workers over a period of months or years. The agricultural land needed to feed a population of 10,000 to 15,000 people, assuming a diet based primarily on wheat, barley, and millet supplemented by domestic animals and wild resources, would have covered an area of several thousand hectares, an area that would have required systematic management, including ploughing, sowing, tending, harvesting, and storage, by a large and well-organized agricultural workforce. The sheer logistical demands of the mega-settlements imply a level of social organization, collective decision-making, and communal coordination that goes far beyond what is typically associated with prehistoric agricultural communities. The question of how the mega-settlements were governed has been the subject of intense scholarly debate. The absence of evidence for palatial architecture, centralized storage facilities, or other markers of centralized political authority has led many scholars to propose that the mega-settlements were governed not by chiefs or kings, but by some form of collective or communal decision-making, a system in which authority was distributed among the heads of households, the elders of kinship groups, or the leaders of neighborhood-level communities within the settlement. This interpretation draws support from the layout of the mega-settlements themselves, which is remarkably egalitarian in its spatial organization. The buildings within the concentric rings are roughly equal in size, suggesting that the households that occupied them were roughly equal in status. There are no buildings that are dramatically larger or more elaborate than the others, no palaces, no temples, no administrative buildings that would indicate the presence of a ruling elite. The central open space, the core of the settlement around which the concentric rings are organized, appears to have been a communal area rather than an elite precinct, a space for public gatherings rather than for the exclusive use of a privileged few. This egalitarian interpretation is appealing but problematic. The organization of a community of 10,000 to 15,000 people, the coordination of construction projects involving thousands of buildings, the management of an agricultural economy that covered thousands of hectares, the resolution of disputes, and the maintenance of social order in a community of unprecedented size. All of these require a level of authority and coordination that is difficult to achieve without some form of centralized leadership. The question is not whether the megasettlements had leaders, because they almost certainly did, but what kind of leadership they had, how that leadership was constituted and legitimated, and how it was exercised in a community that showed no physical evidence of the kind of hierarchical social stratification that characterized the contemporary Near Eastern cities. One possibility is that the leadership of the megasettlements was based on religious or ceremonial authority, rather than on political or economic power. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture produced an enormous number of clay figurines, primarily female figurines, that are among the most distinctive and most widely discussed artifacts of the culture. These figurines, typically depicting stylized female bodies with exaggerated breasts and hips, have been interpreted by many scholars as representations of a goddess, or a set of goddesses associated with fertility, agriculture, and the cycle of life, death, and renewal. If the Cucuteni-Trypillia communities were organized around a shared religious practice, centered on the worship of a fertility goddess, then the leaders of those communities may have been religious specialists, priests or priestesses, who derived their authority from their role as intermediaries between the human community and the divine, rather than from their control of economic resources or military force. Another possibility, advanced by the archaeologist John Chapman, is that the mega-settlements were organized through a system of nested social groups, with households grouped into neighborhoods, neighborhoods grouped into quarters, and quarters grouped into the settlement as a whole, with decision-making authority distributed across these nested levels. In this model, the communal coordination required for the construction and maintenance of the mega-settlement was achieved not through centralized command, but through a hierarchy of nested councils, with each level responsible for the coordination of its own members and the communication of decisions to the levels above and below it. This model is consistent with the archaeological evidence, particularly the evidence from Maidanetsky of assembly houses at regular intervals around the settlement, and it provides a mechanism for collective governance that does not require a single centralized authority. The model also has ethnographic parallels in the political organization of various indigenous societies around the world, societies that manage large-scale collective action through systems of nested decision-making rather than through centralized command. The figurine question has itself been a source of vigorous scholarly debate. The interpretation of the figurines as representations of a goddess, advanced most prominently by the Lithuanian-American archaeologist Marija Gimbutas in her influential but controversial theory of a prehistoric Old European civilization, organized around the worship of a great goddess, has been criticized by many archaeologists who argue that the evidence does not support such a specific interpretation. Gimbutas argued that the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture was part of a broader Old European civilization that extended across southeastern Europe during the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods, a civilization characterized by peaceful, egalitarian, matrifocal social organization and by the worship of a feminine deity associated with the cycle of agricultural fertility. Gimbutas's theory was enormously influential in popular culture and in feminist scholarship, but it has been rejected by most of professional archaeologists, who regard it as insufficiently supported by the evidence and as projecting modern ideological concerns onto a prehistoric society that cannot be understood in terms of modern categories of gender, religion, and politics. The alternative interpretation of the figurines is more cautious and more modest. The figurines may represent ancestors, household spirits, protective deities, or mythological beings, whose specific identities and functions cannot be recovered from the archaeological evidence alone. They may have served as votive offerings placed in buildings or deposited at specific locations within the settlement, as gifts to supernatural beings or as markers of ritual activity. They may have served as teaching aids, used in the instruction of children, or initiates in the myths and the ceremonies of the community. They may have served simply as playthings, toys for children, or decorative objects for the home. The truth is that we do not know what the figurines meant to the people who made them, and any interpretation that goes beyond the physical evidence of the figurines themselves is, inevitably, speculative. What is not speculative is the sheer quantity of the figurines and the consistency of their production across the entire span of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture. Thousands of figurines have been recovered from Cucuteni-Trypillia sites, and their consistent presence across the culture's territory and across more than 2,000 years of cultural continuity indicates that they were a central element of the culture's material and symbolic repertoire. Whatever their specific function, the figurines were important to the people who made them, important enough to justify the investment of time, skill, and materials that their production required, and important enough to be produced in quantity, generation after generation, across the entire life of the culture. The craft specialization, implied by both the pottery and the figurines, raises broader questions about the economic organization of the Cucuteni-Trypillia communities. The production of pottery of the quality found at Cucuteni-Trypillia sites requires specialized skills that are acquired through years of apprenticeship and practice. The production of figurines, while perhaps less technically demanding than the production of fine pottery, nevertheless requires artistic skill and cultural knowledge that implies some degree of specialization. The existence of craft specialists in a community implies a division of labor in which some individuals are freed from the daily tasks of agriculture and animal husbandry to devote their time to specialized production, and this in turn implies a social organization in which the products of specialized labor are distributed to the rest of the community through some mechanism of exchange, whether barter, redistribution, or gift-giving. The nature of this exchange mechanism in the Cucuteni-Trypillia communities is unknown, because the communities had no money, no standardized weights and measures, and no written records that might document economic transactions. But the existence of craft specialization is itself evidence of a level of economic complexity that goes beyond the simple subsistence farming that is typically associated with prehistoric European communities. The role of copper metallurgy in the Cucuteni-Trypillia economy adds another dimension to the picture of economic complexity. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture is classified as a Chalcolithic culture, meaning that it belongs to the transitional period between the Neolithic, the later phase of the Stone Age, and the Bronze Age, a period characterized by the first systematic use of metal, specifically copper, alongside the continued use of stone tools. Copper artifacts, including axes, awls, fish hooks, and ornamental items such as beads and pendants, have been found at Cucuteni-Trypillia sites throughout the culture's territory, and the distribution of these artifacts suggests that copper was obtained through long-distance trade with mining communities in the Balkans, the Carpathian Mountains, and possibly the Caucasus region. The presence of copper artifacts at Cucuteni-Trypillia sites demonstrates that the communities were connected to a wider network of exchange and interaction that extended beyond the immediate territory of the culture, linking the settlements of the Ukrainian forest steppe to communities hundreds of kilometers distant. Let us now consider the broader context of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture within the development of prehistoric Europe, for the mega-settlements of the Ukrainian forest steppe were not the only remarkable achievement of the European Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods. Across the continent, from the Atlantic coast to the Aegean, prehistoric communities were building monuments, organizing societies, and developing technologies that testify to a level of social complexity and cultural creativity that the conventional narrative of European history, with its focus on Greece, Rome, and the Near Eastern origins of civilization, has consistently underestimated. At Stonehenge in southern England, the construction of the famous stone circle began around 3,000 years before the Common Era, roughly contemporary with the later phases of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture. The organization required to transport the enormous sarsen stones from the Marlborough Downs, more than 30 kilometres distant, and the even more distant bluestones from the Preseli Hills of Wales, more than 240 kilometres away, demonstrates a level of social organisation and collective labour mobilisation that is comparable to the construction of the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements. The comparison between Stonehenge and the mega-settlements is illuminating precisely because the two achievements are so different in their form. Stonehenge is a monumental ceremonial structure, a construction of stone designed to endure for millennia. The Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements were communities of wood and clay, designed to be burned and rebuilt in a cycle of renewal. Yet both required the organised labour of large communities, the coordination of complex construction projects over extended periods, and the existence of leadership capable of directing collective action toward a shared goal. The two achievements represent different solutions to the same fundamental challenge: the challenge of organizing large numbers of people for sustained collective action. And their contemporaneity demonstrates that prehistoric Europe was capable of producing multiple independent traditions of large-scale social organization during the same period. In the Orkney Islands, off the northern coast of Scotland, the Neolithic settlements of Skara Brae and the Ness of Brodgar demonstrate that sophisticated architectural planning and communal organisation were not limited to the temperate regions of the continent, but extended to the most remote and inhospitable corners of prehistoric Europe. The Ness of Brodgar, a complex of monumental buildings dating to the late 4th and early 3rd millennia before the Common Era, is one of the most spectacular Neolithic sites in Europe, with massive stone walls, elaborate interior decoration, and evidence of ritual activity that suggests a site of regional or even supra-regional significance. The discovery of the Ness of Brodgar in the 2000s has transformed the understanding of Neolithic Orkney, revealing a complex of monumental architecture that was far larger and far more elaborate than the famous stone circle of the Ring of Brodgar that stands nearby. The site demonstrates that the peoples of the remote Atlantic fringe of Europe were capable of monumental construction and complex social organization at the same time that the peoples of the Ukrainian forest steppe were building the Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements, further undermining the assumption that social complexity in prehistoric Europe was limited to the regions closest to the civilizations of the Near East. In the Balkans, the tells of Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece, artificial mounds created by the accumulation of settlement debris over centuries of continuous occupation, demonstrate that the tradition of large, permanent, densely occupied settlements in southeastern Europe extends back to the earliest Neolithic period, thousands of years before the emergence of the Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements. The tells of the Balkans are among the oldest permanently occupied settlements in Europe, and they provide a cultural context for the Cucuteni-Trypillia phenomenon, demonstrating that the tradition of large, organized, architecturally planned communities in southeastern Europe has deep roots in the Neolithic past. The Vinča culture of the Central Balkans, which flourished from approximately 5500 to 4500 before the Common Era, produced settlements of considerable size and sophistication, with evidence of metallurgy, long-distance trade, and the production of distinctive ceramic forms, including figurines and inscribed tablets that some scholars have interpreted as an early form of writing, though this interpretation remains highly controversial. The Vinča culture was roughly contemporary with the early phases of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, and the two cultures shared certain features, including a tradition of painted pottery and the production of anthropomorphic figurines that suggest connections, whether through direct contact, through shared cultural ancestry, or through participation in a broader network of interaction that linked the communities of southeastern Europe during the 5th and 4th millennia before the Common Era. The Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements must also be understood in the context of the broader tradition of Neolithic and Chalcolithic monumental construction in Europe. Across the continent, From the Atlantic coast to the Aegean, prehistoric communities were building structures that required the organized labor of hundreds or thousands of people, structures that testify to a level of social organization and communal coordination that the conventional narrative of European prehistory has consistently underestimated. The megalithic tombs of Brittany and Ireland, some of which date to the 5th millennium before the Common Era, required the quarrying, transport, and erection of stones weighing many tons, an achievement that implies the existence of organized labor forces and of leadership capable of directing complex construction projects over extended periods. The stone temples of Malta, dating to the 4th millennium before the Common Era, are among the oldest freestanding stone structures in the world, predating the Egyptian pyramids by more than a millennium and demonstrating that the peoples of the Mediterranean were capable of monumental construction at a remarkably early date. The lake dwellings of the Alpine region, built on wooden platforms over the lakes of Switzerland, Austria, and northern Italy during the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, demonstrate a different kind of architectural ingenuity and adaptation to a specific lacustrine environment that required specialized construction techniques and a sophisticated understanding of hydrology and engineering. The numbers are striking when we tally the achievements of prehistoric Europe during the period of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture. Between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era, the peoples of Europe built the mega-settlements of the Ukrainian forest steppe, the stone circles and henges of the British Isles, the megalithic tombs and temples of Malta, Brittany, and Iberia, the lake dwellings of the Alpine region, and the fortified tells of the Balkans, a catalogue of architectural achievement that rivals anything produced by the contemporary Near East, and that demonstrates, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the peoples of prehistoric Europe were capable of complex social organization, monumental construction, and sustained collective action on a scale that the traditional narrative of European history has failed to acknowledge. The Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements are the largest and most striking items in this catalogue, but they are not isolated anomalies. They are the most dramatic expression of a broader European tradition of communal organization and collective construction that was widespread across the continent during the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods. The deeper truth about the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture is that it reveals a fundamental gap in our understanding of the origins of urbanization, a gap that the existing theories of urban development cannot fill, and that the existing categories of archaeological classification cannot accommodate. The Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements are too large to be villages. They are too different from Near Eastern cities to be classified as cities in the conventional sense. They are too complex and too organized to be dismissed as anomalies or as temporary gathering places. They represent something new, something that the existing framework of archaeological theory had not anticipated, and that the existing vocabulary of archaeological description does not have words for. They represent, in the most literal sense, a form of human community that the modern world had forgotten was possible. A community of thousands, organized without kings, without bureaucrats, without armies, without walls, without writing, without any of the institutional apparatus that the textbooks tell us is necessary for communal life at this scale. The existence of the megasettlements is not merely a challenge to archaeological theory. It is a challenge to the assumptions that underpin our understanding of what human societies can achieve and of what they require in order to function. Let that sink in. The conventional theory of urbanization, derived from the study of the ancient Near East, holds that cities emerged as a consequence of a specific set of conditions: the intensification of agriculture, the development of irrigation, the accumulation of food surpluses, the growth of population, the concentration of that population in a single location, and the development of centralized political and administrative institutions to manage the complexity of urban life. The theory is based on the Mesopotamian model, the progression from village to town to city that is documented in the archaeological record of southern Iraq from the earliest farming villages of the 7th millennium before the Common Era to the great cities of the Sumerian and Akkadian periods in the 3rd millennium. The progression is accompanied by the development of specific technologies and institutions, including writing, which emerged in Mesopotamia around 3200 before the Common Era as a tool for the administration of the increasingly complex urban economy, and the temple and palace complexes that served as the administrative and ceremonial centers of the Mesopotamian cities. The Mesopotamian model has had an enormous influence on the way archaeologists think about urbanization, not only in the Near East but around the world. When archaeologists search for evidence of early urbanism in other regions, they typically look for the features that the Mesopotamian model predicts: centralized administration, monumental public architecture, evidence of social stratification, writing or proto-writing, specialized craft production, and long-distance trade. Sites that possess these features are classified as cities or proto-cities. Sites that lack them are classified as villages, even if they are very large. The model has been enormously productive, guiding archaeological research in the Near East and in other regions for more than a century, and generating a wealth of data about the origins and the development of urban life. But the model has also been limiting, because it has established a set of expectations about what cities should look like that has made it difficult for archaeologists to recognize forms of urbanism that do not conform to the Mesopotamian template. The Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements fit none of these criteria. They had no irrigation, they had no writing, they had no temples or palaces, they had no centralized administration in any form that has left traces in the archaeological record. They had no defensive walls, no standing armies, no standardized weights and measures, no seals or tokens, none of the administrative apparatus that characterized the Mesopotamian cities, and that the conventional theory regards as essential for urban life. And yet they were larger, in terms of settled area, than the early Mesopotamian cities. The contradiction between the size of the mega-settlements and the absence of the institutional features that the conventional theory considers necessary for settlements of that size is the central problem of Cucuteni-Trypillia studies, and it is a problem that the existing theories of urbanization cannot resolve without fundamental revision. This is not science fiction, it is documented archaeology. The mega-settlements have been mapped by aerial photography and geophysical survey. Their layouts have been confirmed by targeted excavation. Their chronology has been established by radiocarbon dating. The evidence is extensive, well documented, and largely uncontested. The question is not whether the mega-settlements existed. The question is what they were, how they functioned, and what their existence means for our understanding of the origins and the nature of urban life. The term that scholars have used to describe the Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements has varied, reflecting the difficulty of classifying them within the existing categories of archaeological terminology. Some scholars have called them proto-cities, suggesting that they were on the path toward full urbanization but had not yet arrived. Others have called them urban-like settlements, a deliberately vague term that acknowledges their urban characteristics without committing to the full implications of the label. Still others have rejected the urban terminologies entirely, arguing that the mega-settlements were fundamentally different from cities, and that applying urban terminology to them distorts rather than clarifies their nature. The terminological confusion is itself informative, because it reveals the limitations of the existing categories and the need for new concepts and new vocabulary to describe a form of settlement that the existing framework had not anticipated. The archaeologist David Wengrow and the anthropologist David Graeber, in their influential and controversial work on the origins of social inequality, have argued that the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements represent evidence of a broader pattern in human history, a pattern in which large-scale communal organization preceded, and in many cases existed independently of the hierarchical state systems that have dominated the last 5,000 years of human history. Wengrow and Graeber contend that the conventional narrative of human social development, which assumes a progressive trajectory from band to tribe to chiefdom to state, with increasing complexity and increasing inequality at each step, is not supported by the archaeological evidence, which reveals a much more diverse and much more variable pattern of social organization, including examples like the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements in which large-scale communal organization existed without the hierarchical institutions that the conventional narrative considers necessary. Their argument has been both celebrated and criticized, celebrated for its ambition and its willingness to challenge established assumptions, and criticized for its selectivity and its tendency to read the archaeological evidence in ways that support a predetermined political conclusion. But regardless of one's assessment of their broader argument, Wengrow and Graeber have performed an important service by bringing the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements to the attention of a wider audience, and by insisting that these settlements be taken seriously as evidence of a form of social organization that challenges the assumptions of the conventional narrative. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the relationship between urbanization and institutional complexity. The Mesopotamian model assumes that large, concentrated settlements require centralized institutions, writing, bureaucracy, specialized administration to manage the complexity of urban life. The Cucuteni-Trypillia evidence demonstrates that this assumption is not universally valid, that large, organized, planned settlements can exist without centralized institutions, and that the human capacity for collective organization and communal living is broader and more flexible than the Mesopotamian model suggests. The mega-settlements represent a different kind of urbanism, a different solution to the problem of organizing large numbers of people in a single location, a solution that does not rely on centralized authority, but on communal coordination, on shared cultural norms, on the collective discipline of a community that builds, occupies, destroys, and rebuilds its settlement according to a shared understanding of how communal life should be organized. The challenge to the Mesopotamian model is not merely theoretical. It has practical implications for how archaeologists identify and study early urban settlements around the world. If the Mesopotamian model is the standard, then archaeologists searching for early urbanism will look for the features that the model predicts: writing, seals, monumental architecture, centralized storage, and they will fail to recognize forms of urbanism that do not possess these features. The Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements were not recognized as significant for decades after their discovery, precisely because they lacked the features that the Mesopotamian model had trained archaeologists to look for. They had no temples, they had no palaces, they had no writing. They did not look like Mesopotamian cities, and therefore they were not treated as cities, despite the fact that they were larger, in terms of settled area, than most Mesopotamian cities of the same period. The failure of recognition was not a failure of the evidence, but a failure of the model, a failure to anticipate that urbanization might take forms that did not match the Near Eastern template. The consequences of this failure extend beyond the Cucuteni-Trypillia case. If the Mesopotamian model has caused archaeologists to overlook the mega-settlements of the Ukrainian forest steppe, it may also have caused them to overlook other forms of urbanism in other parts of the world, forms of large-scale communal organization that do not conform to the Near Eastern template, and that have therefore been dismissed, ignored, or misclassified. The Cucuteni-Trypillia case is a warning against the tyranny of models, a demonstration that the categories we use to organize our understanding of the past can also limit that understanding, blinding us to phenomena that do not fit the expected pattern and preventing us from recognizing the full diversity of the human experience. The possibility that the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements represent a form of collective urbanism organized without centralized authority raises questions that go to the heart of political philosophy. The assumption that large communities require hierarchical government, that order in large-scale societies can only be maintained by the concentration of power in the hands of a few, has been a foundational principle of Western political thought from Plato and Aristotle to Hobbes and Locke. The Cucuteni-Trypillia evidence suggests that this assumption may not be universally true, that there is at least one historical example of large-scale communal organization, that functioned without hierarchical government, and that the alternatives to hierarchy may be more viable than the Western philosophical tradition has assumed. Let that sink in. The possibility that the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements represent a form of urbanism based on communal coordination rather than centralized authority has profound implications for our understanding of human social organization. If the mega-settlements were indeed governed by some form of collective decision-making, then the history of urbanization includes at least one major example of a large-scale, planned settlement that was organized without the hierarchical political structures that have characterized cities throughout recorded history. This example challenges the assumption, common in both scholarly and popular discourse, that hierarchical organization is a necessary feature of complex societies, that large communities inevitably produce elites who accumulate power and wealth at the expense of the majority. The Cucuteni-Trypillia evidence suggests an alternative, a model of complex social life in which authority is distributed rather than concentrated, in which decisions are made collectively rather than imposed from above, and in which the physical layout of the settlement reflects and reinforces the egalitarian values of the community that created it. The comparison with the roughly contemporary Mesopotamian cities is particularly illuminating in this regard. In Mesopotamia, the emergence of large settlements was accompanied by the emergence of pronounced social hierarchies, with temple priests and later palace rulers accumulating wealth, political power, and religious authority at the expense of the rest of the population. The monumental architecture of the Mesopotamian cities, the ziggurats, the temples, the palace complexes, are physical expressions of this hierarchical organization, structures that celebrate and reinforce the power of the elite, and that dwarf the modest residences of the commoners who lived in their shadow. The Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements present a strikingly different picture. There are no ziggurats, there are no palaces. The buildings are roughly equal in size. The layout is concentric and symmetrical, organized around a communal center rather than around an elite precinct. If the architecture of a settlement reflects the social values of the community that built it, then the architecture of the Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements reflects values that are fundamentally different from those of the Mesopotamian cities. Values of communal solidarity rather than hierarchical subordination, of shared space rather than exclusive privilege, of collective organization rather than centralized control. The implications of this comparison for our understanding of the origins of social inequality are profound. The standard narrative of human social development, which is derived primarily from the Mesopotamian and Egyptian models, presents the emergence of social inequality as an inevitable consequence of increasing social complexity, a necessary cost of the organizational capacity that makes civilization possible. The Cucuteni-Trypillia evidence challenges this narrative by suggesting that social inequality is not an inevitable consequence of complexity, but a culturally specific response to specific conditions, a response that is characteristic of some complex societies, but not of all. The people of the Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements organized thousands of people into planned communities of extraordinary size, and they did so, as far as the evidence suggests, without the dramatic social inequalities that characterized the contemporary Near Eastern cities. Their example demonstrates that complexity does not require hierarchy, that large-scale communal organization is possible without the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a few, and that the alternatives to hierarchy may be more historically significant than the standard narrative of human social development has acknowledged. The deliberate burning of the settlements takes on a new significance in this context. If the burning was indeed a ritual act, a deliberate destruction that marked the end of one phase of communal life and the beginning of another, then it can be understood as a mechanism for preventing the accumulation of wealth, power, and status that typically accompanies the long-term occupation of a settlement. By destroying the settlement and starting again, the community could prevent any individual or group from accumulating the resources and the political advantages that come with long-term occupancy, effectively resetting the social system to its egalitarian default. The burning was not a waste. It was a form of social maintenance, a mechanism for preserving the egalitarian character of the community by periodically eliminating the material foundations on which social inequality might otherwise be built. This interpretation is speculative, and it has been criticized by scholars who regard it as projecting modern political values onto a prehistoric society, whose actual values and motivations cannot be recovered from the archaeological evidence. The criticism is valid to a point. We cannot know what the people of the Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements thought about equality, about hierarchy, or about the distribution of power, because they left no written record of their thoughts. But the material evidence, the egalitarian layout of the settlements, the absence of palatial architecture, the absence of ostentatious elite burials, and the practice of periodic destruction and rebuilding is consistent with a society that valued communal solidarity over individual accumulation, and the interpretation, while speculative, is grounded in the evidence and is not unreasonable. The loss of the Cucuteni-Trypillia voice, the absence of any written record that might tell us what the people of these extraordinary settlements thought about their own way of life, is perhaps the deepest wound in the story. We can measure their buildings, we can analyze their pottery, we can map their settlements, we can count their figurines and classify their stone tools and identify the species of animals they raised and the crops they grew. But we cannot hear their explanations for the burning, their justifications for the communal organization of their settlements, their understanding of the cycle of construction and destruction that defined their way of life. The material evidence is abundant and informative, but it cannot speak for the people. It can tell us what they did. It cannot tell us what they meant. The silence of the Cucuteni-Trypillia people is made even more poignant by the richness of their material culture. A society that produced pottery of such extraordinary beauty, figurines of such evocative power, and settlements of such ambitious scale was clearly a society of deep cultural sophistication, a society that valued craftsmanship, that rewarded artistic skill, and that invested significant energy in the production of objects that went far beyond the merely utilitarian. The people who painted the spirals on the pottery, who shaped the figurines from clay, who planned the concentric rings of the mega-settlements were people of imagination, of vision, of creative ambition. Their achievements in material culture suggest that their achievements in immaterial culture, in myth, in ritual, in song, in story, in the oral traditions that preserved the knowledge and the beliefs of the community, were equally impressive. But those immaterial achievements are lost. The pottery survives. The stories do not. The figurines endure. The songs are silent. And the gap between what the material evidence preserves and what the oral tradition lost is the measure of what 6,000 years of silence has cost us. What does the Cucuteni-Trypillia story mean for our understanding of European history, of the origins of urbanization, and of the human capacity for social organization? The implications are far-reaching, and they extend well beyond the specific details of the archaeological record into the realm of fundamental assumptions about human nature, about the relationship between complexity and hierarchy, and about the conditions under which large-scale communal life is possible. The first and most direct implication is that the history of urbanization in Europe is much older and much more complex than the standard narrative allows. The standard narrative, which traces the origins of European urban life to the Greek city-states of the first millennium before the Common Era, with roots in the Bronze Age civilizations of the Aegean, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, is not false but is radically incomplete. The Cucuteni-Trypillia megasettlements demonstrate that large, planned, organized communities existed in Europe more than 3,000 years before the Greek city-states, communities that were larger in area than any Greek polis, and that organized thousands of people into functioning social units without the political institutions that the Greek city-states considered essential. The history of European urbanism does not begin with Athens. It begins on the black earth of the Ukrainian forest steppe 6,000 years ago, with settlements that most Europeans have never heard of, and that most textbooks do not mention. The erasure of this history from the standard narrative is not deliberate. It is the product of the long dominance of the Near Eastern model in archaeological thinking, of the political isolation of the Soviet and Eastern Bloc research traditions that first documented the mega-settlements, and of the simple fact that the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, lacking writing and lacking monumental stone architecture, does not produce the kind of dramatic, visually arresting remains that capture the public imagination and that earn a place in the textbooks. The second implication concerns the relationship between urbanization and the state. The conventional wisdom, derived from the Mesopotamian and Egyptian models, holds that urbanization and state formation are closely linked, that cities produce states and states produce cities in a mutually reinforcing cycle of increasing complexity and centralization. The Cucuteni-Trypillia evidence challenges this wisdom by demonstrating that large, organized settlements can exist without states, that the human capacity for communal living at a large scale does not require the hierarchical political structures that have characterized the state throughout recorded history. The mega-settlements were not states. They had no kings, no bureaucrats, no standing armies, no tax collectors, no legal codes, no written records of any kind. And yet they organized thousands of people into communities that functioned effectively enough to endure for decades, and that reproduced themselves across centuries through the cycle of building, occupation, burning, and rebuilding that characterized the culture. The significance of this point for modern political thought should not be underestimated. The assumption that large communities require centralized government, that without a state to enforce order and coordinate collective action, large-scale communal life is impossible, has been one of the foundational premises of Western political philosophy since at least Thomas Hobbes, who argued in the 17th century that life without the state would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements provide a concrete, archaeological counterexample to this assumption, demonstrating that at least one society in human history organized communities of thousands of people, maintained them for decades, and reproduced them across centuries without the centralized authority that Hobbes and his successors considered essential. The counterexample does not prove that modern states are unnecessary. The conditions of the modern world are vastly different from those of the 5th millennium before the Common Era, and the challenges of organizing contemporary societies are incomparably more complex. But it does demonstrate that the human capacity for collective self-governance is greater than the Western philosophical tradition has typically acknowledged, and that the alternatives to centralized state authority may be more viable, at least under certain conditions, than the standard political theories suggest. The existence of the mega-settlements suggests that the state is not the only possible form of political organization for large human communities, and that alternatives to the state, forms of collective governance that do not rely on centralized authority, have existed in the past and may be possible in the future. The third implication is philosophical, and it concerns the nature of permanence and impermanence in human civilization. The Cucuteni-Trypillia people did not build for permanence, they built for the cycle. They constructed their settlements, knowing that they would be destroyed, knowing that the buildings they raised with such care and effort would be reduced to ash within a few decades, knowing that the community would then move on and build again. This acceptance of impermanence, this willingness to invest enormous effort in something that was designed to be temporary, is profoundly different from the values that have characterized most civilizations in recorded history. Civilizations that have built in stone, in brick, in concrete, in steel, precisely because they wanted their structures to endure, to outlast the builders, to stand as monuments to the power and the permanence of the societies that created them. The Cucuteni-Trypillia people rejected this logic of permanence. They chose the logic of renewal, building and rebuilding in an endless cycle that valued the process of creation over the products of creation, the act of building over the building itself. There is a pause that occurs naturally at this point, a moment when the mind reaches beyond the specific facts of the Cucuteni-Trypillia case and grasps something larger. The modern world is built on the assumption that permanence is desirable, that the goal of civilization is to build things that last, that the measure of a society's achievement is the durability of its structures and institutions. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture challenges this assumption by offering an alternative, a model of civilized life in which impermanence is not a failure but a value, in which the destruction of what has been built is not a catastrophe but a renewal, in which the cycle of creation and destruction is not a sign of instability but a mechanism for maintaining the health and the vitality of the community. The modern world's obsession with permanence, with building things that last, with creating structures and institutions that will endure for centuries and millennia, is so deeply ingrained in our cultural assumptions that it is difficult to imagine an alternative. The pyramids of Egypt, the walls of Rome, the cathedrals of medieval Europe, the skyscrapers of the modern city, all of these are celebrated precisely because they endure, because they outlast the generations that built them, because they stand as monuments to the power and the ambition of the societies that created them. The Cucuteni-Trypillia people built on a comparable scale, but with a fundamentally different intention. They built not to endure but to transform, not to resist time but to embrace it, not to leave behind permanent monuments, but to participate in a cycle of creation and renewal that was, in their understanding, more important than any individual settlement, more meaningful than any particular arrangement of buildings and streets and open spaces. Their buildings were temporary, their settlements were temporary, but the cycle was permanent, repeating itself across centuries and across the landscape, a pattern of building and burning and rebuilding that was itself the monument, a monument not to the durability of stone or brick, but to the persistence of the human capacity for collective creation. The question of which model is better, the model of permanence or the model of renewal, is not a question that archaeology can answer, but the fact that both models have existed, that human beings have organized their communal lives according to radically different principles, is itself a discovery of the first importance, because it reminds us that the way we live now is not the only way that human beings have ever lived, and that the alternatives to our current model may be more numerous and more viable than we have imagined. The contemporary relevance of the Cucuteni-Trypillia story is enhanced by the current conflict in Ukraine, which has placed the territory of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture at the center of a geopolitical struggle that has drawn the attention of the entire world. Many of the most important Cucuteni-Trypillia sites are located in regions that have been affected by the conflict, and the preservation of these sites, already threatened by agricultural development and neglect, is now further endangered by the disruption of archaeological research and the destruction of infrastructure. The Cucuteni-Trypillia sites are part of the cultural heritage of Ukraine and of Europe, and their protection is a matter of concern not only for archaeologists, but for anyone who values the preservation of the human past. The decline and disappearance of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, which occurred gradually during the late 4th and early 3rd millennia before the Common Era, is the final chapter of the story, and the one that raises the most difficult questions. The mega-settlements were abandoned, the population dispersed. The cultural traditions that had sustained the communities for more than 2,000 years, the distinctive pottery, the figurines, the concentric settlement plans, and the practice of deliberate burning, all of these disappeared from the archaeological record, replaced by different cultural traditions associated with different populations and different ways of life. The causes of the Cucuteni-Trypillia decline have been debated by scholars for decades, and several factors have been proposed. Environmental degradation, caused by millennia of intensive agriculture on the Chernozem soils, may have reduced the productivity of the land and undermined the economic foundation of the mega-settlements. The strategy of shifting cultivation that may have motivated the periodic relocation of settlements would have become increasingly difficult to sustain as the population grew and the available land diminished, forcing communities to cultivate the same soils more frequently and reducing the fallow periods needed for soil regeneration. Climate change, including shifts in temperature and rainfall patterns that affected the productivity of the agricultural system, may have added additional stress to an economy that was already under pressure from soil depletion. But the most dramatic factor in the decline of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture may have been the arrival of new populations from the Eurasian steppe. Populations associated with the Yamnaya culture, semi-nomadic pastoralists, who may have displaced or absorbed the settled agricultural communities of the Cucuteni-Trypillia territory. The steppe migration hypothesis has been strengthened in recent years by the results of ancient DNA studies, which have revealed a massive influx of steppe-related genetic ancestry into Europe during the late 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, an influx that correlates chronologically with the decline of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture and other late Neolithic and Chalcolithic cultures across Europe. The ancient DNA evidence, published in a series of landmark studies beginning in 2015, has demonstrated that the genetic composition of European populations changed dramatically during the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, with steppe-related ancestry replacing or supplementing the Neolithic farmer ancestry that had characterized European populations since the arrival of agriculture from the Near East thousands of years earlier. The nature of the interaction between the Cucuteni-Trypillia communities and the incoming steppe populations is a matter of intense scholarly debate. Some scholars have proposed a violent model in which the steppe populations invaded the Cucuteni-Trypillia territory, destroyed the settlements, and displaced the agricultural population by force. Others have proposed a more gradual model in which the steppe populations infiltrated the Cucuteni-Trypillia territory over a period of centuries, intermarrying with the local population, adopting some of their cultural practices, and gradually transforming the social and economic systems of the region. The archaeological evidence does not clearly support either model, and the reality may have involved elements of both, with periods of violent conflict interspersed with periods of peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange. The recent ancient DNA evidence has complicated the picture further. The genetic data show that the steppe-related ancestry that entered Europe during the late 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era did not simply replace the existing Neolithic farmer ancestry. Instead, the two ancestral components mixed in proportions that varied from region to region and from population to population, suggesting a process of interaction that was more complex than simple replacement or displacement. In some regions, the steppe ancestry became dominant, suggesting either mass migration or the demographic collapse of the local farming population. In other regions, the Neolithic farmer ancestry persisted alongside the steppe ancestry, suggesting a more gradual process of admixture and cultural exchange. The implications for the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture specifically are still being worked out, as ancient DNA from Cucuteni-Trypillia sites is only beginning to be analysed, but the broader pattern suggests that the end of the Cucuteni-Trypillia way of life was part of a continental-scale demographic transformation that reshaped the genetic and cultural landscape of Europe during the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. What is clear is that the Cucuteni-Trypillia way of life, the mega-settlements, the painted pottery, the figurines, the cycle of building and burning, came to an end during the late 4th and early 3rd millennia, before the Common Era, and that the populations who replaced the Cucuteni-Trypillia communities in the region organized their lives in fundamentally different ways, as mobile pastoralists rather than settled farmers, in small, dispersed camps rather than in large, planned settlements. The contrast between the two ways of life could hardly be more stark. The Cucuteni-Trypillia people built some of the largest settlements in the world, organized thousands of people into planned communities, and sustained their way of life for more than 2,000 years. The steppe pastoralists who followed them lived in small mobile groups, herding cattle and sheep across the open grasslands, burying their dead in individual mounds called kurgans, and leaving behind an archaeological record that is sparse compared to the rich material culture of the Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements. The replacement of a settled agricultural civilization by mobile pastoralists is a pattern that has repeated itself throughout history, from the fall of the Roman Empire to the Mongol conquests of the medieval period, and it carries a resonance that extends beyond the specific details of the Cucuteni-Trypillia case. The settled agricultural communities, with their large populations, their elaborate material culture, and their complex social organization, appear to have been more vulnerable to disruption than their more mobile, more adaptable, and more militarily aggressive neighbors. The Cucuteni-Trypillia people built some of the largest settlements in the world and produced some of the finest pottery in the prehistoric world, but they do not appear to have developed the military organization or the defensive infrastructure that might have protected them against the incursions of the steppe pastoralists. Their egalitarian social organization, if the interpretation of the archaeological evidence is correct, may have left them without the centralized leadership that is needed to organize effective collective defense against an organized external threat. The very qualities that made their settlements remarkable, their size, their openness, their lack of defensive walls, their emphasis on communal life rather than military preparedness, may have made them vulnerable to the forces that ultimately brought them to an end. The irony is bitter. The openness that expressed their values also exposed their weakness. The settlements that had no walls because they had no enemies were eventually overwhelmed by enemies they could not keep out. And so we come to the black earth of the Ukrainian forest steppe, to the flat, fertile landscape where the Cucuteni-Trypillia people built their extraordinary settlements 6,000 years ago, settlements that were the largest human communities on Earth at the time they were built. Settlements that organized thousands of people into planned, functioning communities without the centralized institutions and the hierarchical political structures that the conventional wisdom considers essential for communal life at this scale. The settlements are gone now. They were designed to be gone. They were built to be burned, and they were burned systematically, deliberately, completely, reduced to ash and rubble by the same hands that had raised them, in a cycle of creation and destruction that repeated itself across centuries and across a region stretching from the Carpathians to the Dnieper. The ashes remain. 6,000 years after the fires went out, the fired clay floors and walls of the burned buildings survive beneath the surface of the soil, invisible from ground level, but clearly visible from the air, ghostly circles and rings etched into the black earth by the heat of conflagrations that burned when the pyramids of Egypt were still thousands of years in the future. The aerial photographs reveal the outlines of the settlements with uncanny clarity. The concentric rings of buildings, the central open spaces, the pathways that connected the different parts of the community, all preserved in the soil as a negative image of the community that created them, a photographic record written not in light but in fire. The people who built these settlements left no words behind. They had no writing. They left no inscriptions, no texts, no records of any kind that might tell us who they were, what they believed, how they governed themselves, or why they chose to build and burn and build again. They left their pottery, their figurines, their stone tools, their animal bones, their plant remains, and the fired clay ghosts of their buildings, the material residue of a way of life that endured for more than 2,000 years, and that then vanished, replaced by new peoples, new languages, new ways of organizing the relationship between human beings and the land they inhabit. The pottery they left behind is itself an eloquent testimony to their creative achievement. In museum cases across Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine, the painted vessels of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture glow with the same colors that their makers applied 6,000 years ago. The deep reds, the glossy blacks, the warm whites of a decorative tradition that spanned more than 2 millennia, and that produced some of the finest ceramic art in the history of the human species. The spirals that adorn the vessels seem to pulse with a vitality that transcends the millennia, as though the artists who painted them had captured something living in the clay, something that the passage of 6,000 years has not been able to extinguish. The figurines, with their stylized bodies and their enigmatic expressions, gaze out from behind glass cases with a patience that is itself a kind of communication, a silent assertion that the people who shaped them were present, were conscious, were creative, were human in all the ways that matter, even if the specific meanings that the figurines carried have been lost beyond recovery. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture asks us to rethink what we mean by civilization. It asks us to consider the possibility that the model of permanent, hierarchically organized, State-governed urban life that has dominated human history for the last 5,000 years is not the only possible model. That human beings have found other ways to organize large communities, ways that do not depend on centralized authority, that do not require permanent structures, that do not produce the familiar markers of civilizational achievement, the temples, the palaces, the written records that the conventional definition of civilization demands. The Cucuteni-Trypillia people did not build temples. They did not build palaces. They did not write. They did not amass armies or conquer territories or erect monuments to the glory of their rulers. They built communities. They organized thousands of people into functioning social units. They cultivated the richest soils in Europe. They produced some of the finest pottery in the prehistoric world. They sustained their way of life for more than 2,000 years, and then they let it go, or it was taken from them, and the black earth covered the ashes of their settlements, and the memory of their existence was buried for 6 millennia, until the patient work of archaeologists, working with trowels and brushes and aerial cameras and geophysical equipment, began to bring the outlines of their world back into the light. The modern rediscovery of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture has been shaped by the political circumstances of the region in which the culture is located. For much of the 20th century, the study of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture was conducted behind the Iron Curtain, in the research institutions of the Soviet Union and Communist Romania, where publication was often in Russian, Ukrainian, or Romanian, languages that were not widely read by Western European and North American archaeologists. The result was that the culture remained largely unknown to the international scholarly community until the fall of the communist regimes in the late 1980s and early 1990s opened the region to international collaboration and brought the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements to the attention of a wider audience. The subsequent decades have seen an explosion of international research on the culture, including the collaborative projects at Nebelivka, Maidanets, and other major sites, but the culture remains far less well known than it deserves to be, both within the scholarly community and among the general public. The Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements cannot speak. They have no voice. They have no advocate in the corridors of historical memory, no champion in the textbooks, no place in the popular imagination, alongside the pyramids and in the Parthenon and the Colosseum. They are known to specialists and ignored by almost everyone else, a civilization that was the largest in its world and that is among the least known in ours. The disparity between the scale of the Cucuteni-Trypillia achievement and the depth of the modern world's ignorance about it is itself a subject worthy of reflection, because it reveals the extent to which our understanding of the human past is shaped not by the evidence, but by the assumptions, the biases, and the narrative traditions that determine which achievements are remembered and which are forgotten. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture deserves a place in the standard narrative of human civilizational development, alongside the civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China, as one of the earliest and most ambitious experiments in large-scale communal living in human history. It deserves this place not because it conforms to the criteria that these other civilizations have established. It does not, but because it demonstrates that the human capacity for social organization is broader, more flexible, and more inventive than any single civilizational tradition can encompass. The people of the Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements found a way to organize thousands of people into functioning communities without the institutional apparatus that the other early civilizations considered essential, without writing, without centralized government, without permanent architecture, without any of the features that the textbooks list as the hallmarks of civilization. Their achievement was not lesser for being different. It was greater because it demonstrated that the human capacity for communal life extends far beyond the specific forms that the familiar civilizations have made us expect. 6,000 years of silence, 6,000 years of ash and clay beneath the black earth, 6,000 years of a world that was built and built again. A world that chose the cycle over the monument, community over hierarchy, renewal over permanence, and that sustained that choice for more than 2,000 years before the steppe winds brought the change that ended everything. The Cucuteni-Trypillia people are gone. Their settlements are gone. Their pottery lies in museum cases and storage rooms across Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. Their figurines gaze out with blind clay eyes from behind glass displays. Their fired clay floors lie beneath the surface of the soil, circles in the black earth, visible from the sky but invisible from the ground, the ghostly footprint of a civilization that the world forgot and that the world is only now beginning to remember. The ashes remain, the questions remain, and the silence, the immense, patient, enduring silence of a civilization that built its settlements from wood and clay and then returned them to the earth from which they came, is the last and most eloquent testimony of the Cucuteni-Trypillia people. A testimony that speaks not of permanence but of passage, not of monuments but of moments, not of what endures but of what transforms, and that waits beneath the black earth of the Ukrainian forest steppe for the day when the modern world will finally understand what it means. It has held them for 6,000 years, patiently, silently, waiting for someone to look down from the sky and see the circles in the soil, the ghostly outlines of a world that was built and burned and built again, a world that chose renewal over permanence, community over hierarchy, the cycle over the monument. The Cucuteni-Trypillia people made their choice. They chose to build for the cycle rather than for eternity. And the irony, the deep, quiet, melancholy irony, is that by choosing impermanence, they achieved a kind of permanence after all, the permanence of the ash in the black earth, the permanence of the fired clay floors that have survived 6,000 years of rain and frost and plough and seed, the permanence of the questions they left behind, questions that the modern world is only now beginning to ask, and that it may never fully answer. But the asking itself is an act of recognition, an acknowledgement that the people of the Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements deserve to be remembered, that their achievement deserves to be celebrated, and that their profound silence, 6,000 years deep and 6,000 years wide, deserves at last to be heard. What kind of people were they? These builders of the largest settlements in the world. What songs did they sing as they carried the clay for the floors and wove the branches for the walls? What stories did they tell their children about the ancestors who had built and burned the settlements before them, and about the descendants who would build and burn again after they were gone? What did they feel when the fire was lit and the buildings began to burn, when the work of years went up in flames, and the settlement that had been their home was consumed by the inferno that they themselves had kindled? Did they mourn? Did they celebrate? Did they stand in silence and watch the flames consume their world, knowing that the world would be rebuilt, that the cycle would continue, that the burning was not an ending, but a transformation, not a death, but a rebirth? We will never know. The fire consumed the answers along with the buildings, and the silence that followed has lasted 6,000 years and will last forever. But the questions remain, written in ash and clay in the black earth of the Ukrainian forest steppe. And they are questions worth asking, because they are questions about what it means to be human, about how human beings choose to organize their lives, about what they value and what they are willing to sacrifice, about what they build and why they build it and what they do when the building is done. The Cucuteni-Trypillia people answered these questions differently from the way we answer them, and their answers have been buried for 6 millennia, awaiting the day when the modern world would be willing to listen. That day may finally be arriving, as the work of archaeologists and historians brings the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture slowly, incompletely, but irreversibly into the light of modern understanding, and as the questions that the culture raises begin to penetrate the consciousness of a world that has much to learn from a civilization it has never heard of.